In December 1942, somewhere above the Solomon Islands, Eddie Kowalski, a 19-year-old tail gunner, was in a B-17. His hands clutched a Browning M2, which was shaking hard. A Japanese Zero jet came into view at his 10 o'clock, maybe about 300 yards away, flying from left to right. Eddie did what came naturally. He aimed right at the enemy plane and pulled the trigger. Bullets flew, but Eddie watched as they all missed the Zero by going behind it. The Japanese pilot didn't even try to dodge. He just kept flying untouched. This wasn't just Eddie's problem. This exact thing happened loads of times in World War II in the early years. American gunners, even though they were well-trained, eager, and had the best guns, were missing their targets. A lot. The Army Air Forces did research in early 1943 looking at gun camera footage for missions over Europe and the Pacific. The results were awful. Well-trained gunners were hitting less than 4% of the time against planes flying across their path. So, for every 100 bullets shot at a plane moving sideways, 96 missed completely. The math was harsh. A fight might last 8 to 12 seconds before the enemy either left or got out of range. The Browning M2 shot about 800 bullets a minute, around 13 a second. So, in 10 seconds, a gunner could shoot 130 bullets. With a 4% hit rate, maybe 5 bullets would hit. 5 hits weren't enough to take down a Zero, not to mention tougher planes like the Focke-Wulf FW-190. German and Japanese fighters could take many .50 caliber rounds and keep flying. The human cost was terrible. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force, flying over Europe, lost an average of 188 bombers each month. Each B-17 had 10 people on board. That meant 1,880 airmen were killed, captured, or went missing every month. Often, these losses happened because bombers couldn't defend themselves well against fighters. The gunners were doing as they were trained. They tracked the target, kept it in sight, and controlled their shots. The issue wasn't their bravery, it was physics. And physics doesn't care about bravery. Every gunner just aimed at what they saw. It seemed right. Point at what you want to hit, pull the trigger, and you hit it. This works when shooting at a still target or even a deer moving at 20 miles per hour. But enemy fighters weren't deer. They moved across the gunner's view at over 300 miles per hour. Some later models, like the Me-262 jet, could hit 540 miles per hour. At those speeds, by the time a bullet traveled from a gun to where the target was gone. The bullet was fast, about 2,900 feet per second from the Browning M2. It seemed instant, and at close range against slow targets it was. But in air combat, close range was 200 to 400 yards, and the targets were flying super fast. A Zero at 300 miles per hour traveled 440 feet every second. On a 300-yard shot, 900 feet, a bullet took about 0.31 seconds to travel. It doesn't sound like much, but in that time, the Zero moved another 136 feet, about 11 car lengths. The gunner aimed at where the plane was, but the bullet arrived where the plane had been a third of a second ago, hitting only air while the fighter flew on. This was called deflection error. The military knew about it before World War II, but knowing it and fixing it in combat were two different things. The needed deflection wasn't a small adjustment. It was big and hard to believe. Against a target moving sideways at 300 yards, a gunner needed to aim about 15 to 20 feet ahead of the plane. This meant aiming at empty sky, trusting the target would fly into the bullets. Every human feeling fought against it. Gunnery teachers tried to teach deflection in training, but it didn't work well. The Army Air Forces Gunnery School in Laredo, Texas, put students through tough programs for 1942. Trainees spent hours in simulators, shot at targets from moving trucks, and studied diagrams. None of it really helped in real combat. The issue was that deflection wasn't one simple thing. It changed with the target's speed, angle, range, altitude, and whether the plane was climbing or diving, or if your plane was turning. A B-17 ball turret gunner fighting a BF-109 attacking head-on needed a different deflection than when fighting the same plane from the side. And he had maybe 4 seconds to figure it all out while being shot at, while his plane shook from enemy fire, and while his oxygen mask fogged up at 25,000 feet. The mental part was as hard as the technical part. Gunners who lived through their first missions and tried deflection often stopped after it seemed to fail. They'd aim ahead, fire, see their bullets fly through empty sky, and think they aimed too far ahead. Next time, they'd aim closer to the plane, correcting in the wrong way, trusting their eyes over physics. Gun camera footage from 1943 shows this often. First shots with lead, then later shots walking backward until the gunner shot right at or behind the target. Losses rose. 8th Air Force record for missions to Schweinfurt in October 1943 showed 20% losses. 60 bombers didn't return out of 291. The survivors landed with dead and wounded, damaged planes, and engines smoking. In debriefings, gunners said the same. They'd been shooting, their guns worked, but they couldn't hit anything. Something had to change fast, or the bombing campaign would fail. The answer had been around since 1924, written by someone most airmen didn't know. Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, an artillery officer who was good at ballistics, had written a paper called The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery while teaching at the Army's Field Artillery School. Puckle wasn't just a theorist. He'd served in France in World War I, seen the first attempts at air combat, and knew that faster planes would cause problems with targeting that old methods couldn't solve. His paper clearly showed the math. Puckle showed that as planes went faster than 150 miles per hour, people couldn't guess the needed deflection. He figured that against a target at 250 miles per hour at a right angle, a gunner would need to aim 4 or 5 plane lengths ahead. He added charts showing the lead needed for different speeds, ranges, and angles. A 200-yard shot at a 90-degree angle against a 300 miles per hour target needed a 47-foot lead. The same target at 400 yards needed 94 feet. These numbers were huge, and Puckle said that without help, air gunners would be useless in a decade. The Army filed his paper away. Through the 1920s and 30s, planes got better, but gunnery training stayed the same as in World War I. Teachers taught basic marksmanship, as if students were getting ready for a rifle match instead of a 300 miles per hour chase. Those who pushed for better deflection training were ignored. People thought Americans were good shots, like Daniel Boone and Sergeant York, and that those skills would work in air combat with practice. They didn't. When the U.S. entered World War II in 1941, the Army Air Force's gunnery training was not ready for modern air combat. The standard program lasted 4 weeks. Students fired about 1,000 rounds total. Most shots were at still targets or targets moving slowly in straight lines. No training matched the chaos of an FW-190 diving through a bomber group at 400 miles per hour while doing a barrel roll. Graduates got their wings, flew to England or the Pacific, and found their training was useless when a zero zipped across their sights. By mid-1942, desperate commanders started searching old libraries for anything that could help. Captain Robert Williams, in the 8th Air Force Gunnery Section, found Puckle's 1924 paper. He read it and sent a memo to his boss with 2 underlined words. He knew. Puckle had predicted this disaster 18 years before the first B-17 flew in combat over Europe. His math was right, his warnings were correct, and many Americans had died because no one listened. The question wasn't if Puckle was right. The math proved it. The question was whether anything could be done. It seemed impossible to train gunners to figure out deflection while being shot at. But if figuring it out didn't work, maybe something else would. The British had started finding answers in 1940. RAF Squadron 609, flying Spitfires, had a similar problem. Their pilots were brave, and their planes were great, but they were missing targets. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas looked at gun camera footage and saw their hit rate against Bf-109s was around 6%. Pilots were using all their ammunition and watching German fighters fly home untouched. Squadron leader Horace Darley, who commanded 609 Squadron, stopped all flying for 3 days in August 1940, during the Battle of Britain, when every fighter was needed. He did live-fire tests that broke every rule in the RAF training book. Darley had shot clay pigeons before the war and knew something about leading moving targets that military thinkers had missed. The best shooters didn't figure out lead. They felt it. Their brains knew the target's movement, and they moved the gun ahead without thinking. Darley wondered if fighter pilots could learn the same thing. His test was simple. A Hurricane towed a target banner, while Spitfire pilots made passes. But instead of aiming carefully and trying to figure out the lead, Darley told them to do something crazy. Don't aim. Watch the target's movement, track it with your eyes, and start firing while turning to follow. Let the deflection happen naturally through the turn, not by trying to aim ahead. Shoot where you feel the target is going, not where you see it now. The first tries were failures. Pilots missed the banner by 50 feet. But Darley made them repeat it again and again. 40 passes each day for 3 days. No lectures about ballistics, just repetition with one rule. Fire while moving, not after you've settled on the target. By the third day, something happened. The pilots' hit rates rose, not hugely, from 6% to maybe 12%. But that doubling meant twice as many bullets hit German planes, leading to more kills or damaged planes unable to fly. Darley wrote down his results and sent them to headquarters. He said that the pilots who got better fastest weren't the best shooters before. They were the ones who trusted their peripheral vision and sense of motion. Darley thought the conscious brain was too slow for air combat. The answer was to train the subconscious to handle deflection automatically, like a baseball player knows where a fly ball will land without doing math. Fighter Command shared Darley's findings, but it wasn't used everywhere. Some squadrons liked it. Others thought it was nonsense. The RAF's Training Command didn't like it because their teachers had years of experience teaching marksmanship. But the results spoke for themselves. Squadrons that used motion-based shooting had better kill ratios in the fall of 1940. By early 1941, it quietly became standard, even if the training books didn't say so. American observers in Britain took notes on Darley's methods, but the U.S. Army Air Forces had a different issue. Fighter pilots could learn deflection, but bomber gunners couldn't. A Spitfire pilot used movement to create the lead. A waist gunner in a B-17 stood still while his plane flew straight through fire. He could only use his hands on the gun and his eyes on the target. If figuring things out was too slow and motion wasn't possible, the answer had to be mechanical. Enter MIT, specifically the Radiation Laboratories Division 7, made in early 1942. The name was meant to hide what they really built, fire control systems. The head of the division, Dr. Charles Stark Draper, had spent years building instruments for planes. Draper knew the deflection issue wasn't about shooting, it was about predicting. A gun sight needed to show the gunner where the target would be when the bullets arrived, not where it was now. The Mark 14 gun sight came from Draper's lab in 1943. It looked like science fiction, a reflector sight linked to a gyroscope that weighed 28 pounds and needed power from the plane. The gunner turned a dial to match the target's wingspan, giving the sight the range it needed. He tracked the target for about 2 seconds. During that time, the gyroscope measured how fast the target was moving across the field of view. Here's where it became special. The Mark 14 used gears and cams, analog computers built from metal, to figure out the deflection in real time. It used the range from the gunner, the speed from the gyroscope, and the known properties of the .50 caliber round. Then it figured out how far ahead to aim and showed it as a lighted dot in front of the target. The gunner aimed at the dot, not the plane. And if he tracked correctly, the dot showed him exactly where to shoot. The Mark 14 solved math problems in seconds that would take a human minutes, and it updated 30 times a second as the target changed. Tests in Norfolk, Virginia, in 1943 showed results that seemed unreal. Gunners who had never hit more than 5% of targets jumped to 18% with the Mark 14 on their first day. After a week, the rate climbed above 25%. That was a 5-fold improvement, meaning 5 times more enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed. But making and installing thousands of Mark 14 sites would take time that the Allies didn't have. Production started in 1944, and new planes got them first. Most gunners still used basic sights. They needed something they could use now without new tech or electrical changes. They needed a way to use what they already had. The answer came from the gunners themselves from the Pacific. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming, a waist gunner, had flown 31 missions and survived 4 plane crashes by March 1944. Fleming wasn't an officer and didn't have a college degree, but he'd fired about 40,000 rounds and seen hits on 7 enemy planes. He'd also kept a notebook. Fleming's notebook had something special: sketches of enemy planes with lines showing where he'd aimed during successful fights. He measured these leads by comparing them to the plane's length, 2 or 3 plane lengths ahead. On March 14, 1944, Fleming showed his notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare. O'Hare knew what he was seeing: deflection data from real combat. He told Fleming to train every gunner, not with lectures, but with exercises using a method known as spot shooting. Fleming had gunners stand at their positions while someone walked along the deck holding a model plane. As the model flew past, Fleming taught gunners to aim forward by specific amounts: 1 plane length for small angles, 2 for medium angles, 3 or more for steep angles. The key was giving gunners a visual they could remember and use fast. The skeptical leaders allowed testing during operations off Truck Lagoon in March 1944. They tracked results before and after Fleming's training. The results were clear. Before, gunners averaged 4.2 hits per 100 rounds. After 6 weeks of spot shooting, the rate climbed to 9.1 hits per 100. The method had more than double their hits. Word spread in the Pacific Fleet. By May 1944, versions of Fleming's method were being taught on other carriers. Leaders added their own ideas, but the main idea stayed: give gunners a simple visual system based on the target size, removing the need to calculate. A gunner didn't need to know about bullet flight time. He just remembered 3 plane lengths forward. The method worked because it matched how people see. Our brains are good at comparing sizes, but bad at judging distances. Asking a gunner to lead by 50 feet meant nothing when he didn't know what 50 feet looked like at 300 yards. But lead by 2 plane lengths gave him a standard he could use without thinking. The plane he was tracking became its own measuring stick. The Army Air Forces used similar training by mid-1944, calling it radius of action shooting. Training manuals included drawings showing lead distances based on the target's wingspan or length. The 8th Air Force Gunnery School retrained everyone in June 1944. Mission losses began to fall. July 1944 showed 3.4% bomber losses per mission, compared to 5.2% the previous October. Hundreds of men flew home instead of dying. But knowing the method and using it in combat were tough, even with spot shooting. Psychologists studied this response, interviewing returning gunners. The issue wasn't knowledge. Gunners knew the lead distances. The issue was that knowledge vanished under stress, replaced by instinct. Aim at the threat. Captain Harold Klein, an Army psychologist, studied this response using gun camera footage and interviews. He found a pattern he called threat fixation collapse. Gunners would start with proper deflection, but as the enemy closed and danger grew, their aim drifted back until they shot right at or behind the target. Klein's data showed this happened fastest during head-on attacks, where closing speed was over 500 miles per hour and the gunner had only 2 seconds to react. Under that stress, the method disappeared. The only fix was repetition, so much that deflection became automatic. This needed training time that the military couldn't afford in 1942 and 1943. But by 1944, training programs were better. The standard course grew from 4 weeks to 8, then 10. Students fired 5,000 rounds instead of 1,000, and over half went toward moving targets at combat speeds. The Naval Air Gunner School made a drill where they put .50 caliber guns on turrets that could spin fast. High-speed boats towed targets while changing distance and angle. Gunners shot repeatedly until the act of leading became automatic. Teachers didn't talk. They just had students shoot, check their pattern, and adjust. The subconscious learned through feedback faster than the conscious mind learned through teaching. Expert gunners who survived 30 missions showed something special in combat footage. Their aim stayed steady under stress. When a FW-190 came through the formation with cannon fire, they kept their lead automatically. Their conscious minds might be scared, but their hands kept the right sight picture. They'd reached a state of no mind, where the technique happened without thought. But reaching that level took time and ammunition that most didn't get. The math of wartime training was hard. If creating an expert shooter took 5,000 rounds and 10 weeks of training, but the war needed 50,000 new gunners in 6 months, compromises were made. Most gunners never became truly automatic. They could do deflection when they had time to think, but they broke down under stress or in unexpected situations. This made a difference in combat. A bomber group's defense wasn't equal. It relied on who was in which position. A group with veterans could fight off attacks that would ruin a group of new crews. German pilots learned to see this, targeting bombers that fired hesitantly and avoiding groups with heavy, accurate fire. The deflection revolution that started with British tests and American need didn't end with World War II. The main idea, aim where the target will be, not where it is, became key to every weapon made after. The Mark 14 gun sight changed into the Mark 18, then into computers that could handle dozens of things at once. By Vietnam, fighter planes had radar that figured out deflection, so pilots only had to keep targets in range. Modern air combat has mostly moved past guns. Missiles intercept at ranges where leading would require miles. But the physics is the same. A missile uses radar to update its path to where the target will be. Even video games use deflection, teaching players the same lesson. Aim where the target is going. Games require players to lead moving targets, and gamers feel the same frustration as the gunners in 1942 until they learn that leading is needed. The best players get to the point where they adjust aim without thinking. The change from 4% hit rates to over 20% represents one of the biggest changes of World War II, done not with better tech, but by understanding how people think. Thousands of airmen lived, enemy fighters went down, and bombing campaigns reached their goals. Someone finally realized that human instinct can be wrong, and that survival meant ignoring what felt right and trusting physics. The gunners who learned to aim at empty sky proved something about people under pressure. We can change our responses to fit what's real, not what we think should be real. That lesson stays important anywhere that instinct and answers point in different ways.